Welcome to Your Vote 2024 Town Hall. My name is Paola Rodriguez, and I am your host this evening. Tonight, we will be tackling the future of abortion in Arizona. Since the overturn of Roe v. Wade in 2022, the United States Supreme Court made it clear that abortion is an issue that should be regulated by individual states. Across the country, voters in states like Kansas and Montana protected abortion access within its constitution, while other states like Missouri enacted trigger laws, effectively banning abortion entirely with few exceptions. Arizona's battle to keep access has a bit of a more complicated history. We will talk about how we got here and what to expect with the upcoming election. Here with us, we have University of Arizona professor emerita of law, Barbara Atwood, who specializes in family law, as well as UA professor and political scientist Samara Klar, who studies how individuals' personal identities and social surroundings influence their political attitudes and behavior. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Barbara, a lot has happened over the last 2 months. Can you walk me through how the Arizona Supreme Court decision that came down on April 9th, what that said, and what were the subsequent events that happened afterwards?
Sure, Paula, thank you, and thanks for having me on the program. In order to understand that opinion, you have to go back just a little bit. Actually, you could go back to the 19th century, but I won't take us there. In the spring of 2022, before the Dobbs decision was announced, the Arizona legislature passed what we know as the 15-week law, permitting elective abortion up to 15 weeks of gestation and restricting abortions post 15 weeks to medical emergencies. Then the Dobbs decision came down, and as everyone knows, that overturned Roe v. Wade. In the aftermath of Dobbs, then Attorney General Brnovich began to make efforts to have the old territorial ban, which had been on the books ever since 1864, to basically bring it back to life. And his argument was that Roe v. Wade was the only reason that that law was not effective. It had been kept on the books, the legislative statute books, ever since it was enacted. And he said, now with Roe v. Wade gone, Roe v. Wade, of course, recognizing a constitutional right to terminate pregnancy, with that out of the picture, he says, this old law should now be in full force and effect. And it's that case, it's that his effort to get this old law back into effect that began in the Pima County Superior Court. He was successful at that stage. Up to the Court of Appeals, he was not successful. The Court of Appeals issued an opinion basically saying this old law and the new law, the so-called 15-week gestation law, should be harmonized. It's kind of a rule of statutory construction. We're going to make them both be effective by limiting the old law to people who are not medical providers. That was maybe a creative bit of judicial interpretation, but it comported with some very standard principles of law, where you try to give two laws effect and without repealing one. That case went up to the Arizona Supreme Court, and that's the case that they decided April 9th. And they took a very different view. This 15-week law, importantly, contains provisions that state, number one, this law does not create or recognize a right to abortion. So that's not what this law is about. It also said this law does not repeal the territorial ban or any other abortion regulation. And the Arizona Supreme Court, in a 4-2 opinion, one of the 7 justices, Justice Montgomery, had recused himself. In a 4-2 opinion, held that the Arizona legislature has always basically intended to reenact, to bring back to life the old territorial ban it got to that point by looking to the provisions in this new law, the 15-week law, saying we are not repealing by implication or otherwise this old territorial ban. And so 4 members of the court concluded that the legislature had only sort of with reluctance complied with the constitutional ruling of Roe v. Wade all these years, and that the 15-week law itself was a restriction. It also would not have withstood scrutiny under Roe v. Wade, but the court concluded that given the Arizona legislature's indications that they really wanted to outlaw basically elective abortion. And to make his point, I'll just read you a sentence from the opinion. This is Justice Lopez, who wrote the majority opinion. He said, in light of this opinion, physicians are now on notice that all abortions, except those necessary to save a woman's life, are illegal, and that additional criminal penalties under these newer laws may also apply. But in other words, the court was saying, we're not going to try to make these statutes, we're not going to make them comport with one another. We're going to just say this old law is effective, and it essentially trumps everything else. So there was I think, a great dissent by 2 justices, the Chief Justice and the Vice Chief, but that was announced on April 9th, and that sort of put Arizona's providers into sort of chaos. The court delayed the effectiveness of its order for a couple of weeks in order for the current AG, Chris Mays, to decide, what exactly she wanted to do, what was going to be the next step. Planned Parenthood also, of course, is a party to this litigation. So that's where that stands. And of course, there's been a number of things that have happened since then. I don't know if you want me to go into that at this point.
It sounds very complicated so far, and as we walk through the rest of the subsequent events, I'm happy we will be tackling those issues. And as we walk through these complicated issue, if you, the audience members, are wanting to ask a question, please put them in the Q&A section. We will be answering them throughout our show. But in terms of abortion access right now, Barbara, where are we, and how did that happen to the access that we're seeing right now?
Well, to go back to what the Arizona Supreme Court did, they did delay the effectiveness of their opinion initially for a 2-week period. It's been delayed subsequently for 90 days at the behest of Attorney General Chris Mays, who persuaded the court that she's considering filing a petition for certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the court accommodated her. There's another separate litigation that imposed a 45-day delay. So all those delays together mean that the ruling that the 1864 ban on abortion except to save the life of the pregnant person, that won't go into effect until September 26th. And so there's, that right now, abortion access is available in Arizona under the 15-week law. That law provides elective abortion up to 15 weeks of gestation. As I said earlier, it is quite restrictive for abortions sought later than 15 weeks. And the medical emergency definition is restrictive in cases of a medical emergency that justify an abortion post 15 weeks. Those must be abortions to prevent death or the permanent impairment of a major bodily function. There's no rape or incest exception in the 15-week law. So it is right now, we're under that regime. The Arizona Supreme Court's opinion resurrecting the 1864 law is on hold. But meanwhile, as people know, the Arizona legislature has repealed that law. Governor Hobbs has signed that repeal, and that repeal of the law will go into effect 90 days after the adjournment of the Arizona state legislature. That's not clear when that's going to happen. So it's still possible that there will be a brief period of time where the old ban would be in effect. It's still possible. It's unlikely, people say, but possible. But at the same time, the governor issued an executive order a year ago stating that only the attorney general of the state had authority to prosecute offenses of abortion laws. And Attorney General Mays has stated that she will not prosecute. So there's a tension, of course, between what they are saying and what the legislature, both houses of the legislature being Republican majority, what they want. And people, it's not clear whether the governor's executive order is going to stand. It's being, at least some people are questioning whether she has that authority to do so. So, but at this point in time, abortion access, again, is available up to elective abortions up to 15 weeks. There are a number of restrictions in Arizona that have been enacted over the last 50 years, basically, since 1973. Very stringent abortion regulations for clinics, informed consent laws, requirements that every person seeking an abortion receive a sonogram, be told about the developmental stages of the fetus. There are restrictions on reasons that one can get an abortion. The drug mifepristone, the abortion medication mifepristone and misoprostol. We have some laws that prohibit the use of telemedicine for the prescribing of those drugs, and a law prohibiting the mailing of those drugs. So we are in a restrictive regime in Arizona, but we are not under the old territorial ban at this point in time.
What's interesting is when we hear about the territorial ban, we hear that it comes from 1864, but that law was in a code of laws. Can you walk me through what that was and what were some of the other things that we saw within that code?
Yeah, that's often referred to as the Howell Code because a guy named William Howell, who was a New York judge, but was appointed by President Abraham Lincoln to draft a code for this new territory, Arizona. And Lincoln was primarily interested in Arizona outlawing slavery. This was, the Civil War was still raging. And so Howell drafted a code, and this abortion restriction, it reads in sort of awkward language for today, but it talks about, it makes it illegal to help a woman procure a miscarriage by device or instrument or poison, and imposes a punishment of from 2 to 5 years unless it's necessary to save her life. That was situated in the poison section of this code. And it was, I think, because people viewed abortion medications as poison, they were interfering with a woman's health. It was not imbued with the moral and religious ideology that we see today. But the legislature essentially adopted his code without changing it, without altering it. It was like he handed it to them, they appreciated it and paid him a handsome sum. but it also reflects the era. There were the legislature itself, the territorial legislature was all male, all white. The laws at that time and part of this code outlawed or prohibited non-white people from testifying or offering evidence against white people. Interracial marriage was prohibited. The code criminalized the quote infamous crime against nature with man or beast, punishable by 5 years to life. It also, women had no vote. They could not serve on juries. They could not hold public office. And so it's, that was the territorial ban situated in a very different era where women absolutely had no voice.
When we compare abortion regulations from our state to, let's say, other states that have enacted abortion restrictions, are we seeing similar trends where these laws are coming from centuries back, or is Arizona unique in this situation?
There were a number of states in that era, in the sort of second half of the 1800s, enacting laws. This law actually was copied from a comparable provision in from California law, but I think Arizona may be unique in the continual reenactment of this law and taking it without much alteration at all in the language and plopping it into the legislative code, even after it was struck down in 1973, after Roe v. Wade was decided. It was recodified. It was clear that the legislature, was basically holding on to this. And I think most states modernized their laws. Some, of course, have retained very restrictive laws, but Arizona, unlike about a dozen other states, did not have a trigger law in place when the U.S. Supreme Court decided Dobbs. And that was important in some people's views, to how to interpret the impact of Dobbs on Arizona law. The fact that the Arizona legislature had not said, we want this old law to spring back to life if Roe v. Wade is struck down. The Arizona Supreme Court addressed that, the fact that the Arizona legislature had not done that, and said it was basically irrelevant. It didn't matter because the legislature had indicated its intent by keeping that law on the books. And also, I should mention, there's a law that's a statement of philosophy, basically a construction provision in Arizona, in the Arizona statute, saying that all the rights, privileges, and immunities of people in Arizona are also entitled to be enjoyed by unborn children. The unborn child has all the rights, privileges, and immunities of other persons, residents of Arizona. That was referred to in the Arizona Supreme Court opinion, and they pointed to it as another indication of what the legislature wants. It's a personhood statement. That provision of law, though, has been enjoined by a federal district court as unconstitutionally vague. It does not give medical providers, sufficient notice of what they're allowed to do or not, at the risk of criminal penalties or losing their professional license. So it was troubling to many people that the Arizona Supreme Court pointed to that statute and relied on it as sort of to support its conclusion that the legislature intends to outlaw abortion except for the purpose of saving the pregnant person's life. It's that question that Attorney General Chris Mays has focused on as potentially giving the state an avenue to take this case to the US Supreme Court. Um, anyway, that she used that as in her motion for a delay of the Arizona Supreme Court's opinion of its effectiveness. And she, was granted that 90-day delay, but it was that particular part of the opinion that gave her at least a colorable argument for getting an audience before the US Supreme Court.
Since the overturn of Roe versus Wade in 2022, many pollsters have been saying that abortion is a deciding issue for the 2024 presidential election. Samara, you spent quite a bit of your career studying how identities and social surroundings influence how people vote. Have you seen how the issue of abortion has changed people's perspectives on how their vote is going to be used this fall?
Well, I think abortion's become much more relevant to people's votes since the overturn of Roe versus Wade, because now your vote could actually influence whether or not abortion is legal in your state. So it's become a really salient issue for a lot of voters, especially a lot of younger voters. And it's a really important issue for voters. I've been doing some polling in Arizona, and I find that very large percentages, 75, 80% of voters in Arizona say that abortion is a really important issue for them when they're casting their vote this fall.
Has it always been this way, or has it changed because of the Supreme Court decision that happened in 2022?
The Supreme Court decision had a huge impact because before 2022, a lot of people didn't see abortion as under threat. They didn't see their vote as particularly connected to abortion rights. It was potentially connected by way of, the Supreme Court justices that the president could appoint, but that was sort of more of a sophisticated line of thinking when you're choosing your vote. But now we're at a point where here in Arizona, it is very likely, almost certainly going to be on the ballot in November, and it's having a really direct connection to how people are thinking about their vote choice.
And as we continue talking about the election this fall, listeners, you may be able to send in questions through our Q&A chat below. Feel free to send them in. We will answer them throughout tonight's conversation. So, so far from what you've seen, how are Arizonans polling when it comes to their views on abortion restrictions?
Well, I did a poll just about a month and a half ago, a representative poll of Arizona registered voters, and I find really strong support for abortion rights. Obviously, abortion is a really nuanced issue, and there's a lot of different perspectives that people were supporting. Overall, I found it was sort of interesting. I had asked about a ban without any exceptions, which seems sort of like an unlikely outcome, but that is the pre-territorial law. Only 7% of Arizonans supported that pre-territorial law. That's 7. About 25% of registered voters in Arizona do support a ban without exceptions. But as Barbara referenced before, what I find is about the same number she said, about 2/3, about 66% of Arizonans do support abortion rights to some extent. Interestingly, I find almost 41% of Arizonans say that abortion should always be left to a woman and her doctor. That's a pretty high percentage among a general population of registered voters. But about generally, 65, 70% believe that abortion should be legal at some point during the pregnancy. And there is division as opposed to when it comes to the specific point that people support.
There's a lot of conversation as to how this will affect the presidential election, but what about local and state officials? Are Republicans up at the state capitol at risk of losing their slim majority?
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of evidence of that after the Supreme Court ruling came down, and immediately Republicans in Arizona started sort of scrambling to distance themselves from the ban as quickly as they could. The Republicans have spent quite a long time aligning themselves with the pro-life position. And Democrats have sort of owned the pro-choice position over the last really several decades now. Now, what we're seeing in polling is that American voters don't support a ban and Arizona voters don't support a ban. And Republican politicians clearly are aware of this because we saw politicians like Carrie Lake and Juan Scamani come out with statements distancing themselves from the ban, renouncing the ban. And I think Republicans in Arizona now are really trying to figure out what their coherent position is going to be in Arizona. We don't really get a clear picture right now as to what the Republican Party's position is going to be. Largely, we hear that they think it should be left to voters, but that alone is a little vague because it always is going to depend what the language on the ballot is. But that's something that I think is a tricky position for Republicans in Arizona right now and across the country.
We did get an audience question in. Could the issue drive turnout in general more than it does other years?
Absolutely. Having abortion on the ballot is going to be a huge mobilizer for many voters. In the poll that I did, I asked how important is this issue? And as I told you, 3/4 of Arizona voters say it's very important, but it's actually the voters who support abortion rights who say it's more important. Those who are pro-life actually rate it as a somewhat less important issue. So it looks like having abortion on the ballot is going to be particularly mobilizing for people who probably are liberal in other ways. And that's going to be really helpful for Democratic candidates. In Arizona, we have such tight electoral outcomes that really anything could help. I mean, you could ask me, is the weather going to impact the election? Honestly, maybe. We have such close elections here, anything could do it. But a big issue like abortion on the ballot will absolutely play a role in the fall.
With Republicans like Senate candidate Carrie Lake, who have seemingly changed their views on abortion throughout these past couple months, will that affect how voters are seeing their campaign right now?
Well, for issues for whom abortion is really important, I think it's going to be important for them that their candidate has the same level of commitment to an issue. But those are likely to be pro-choice voters who never really supported Carrie Lake that much anyway. For pro-life voters, they may lose a little bit of faith in someone like Carrie Lake. But again, we don't have a large proportion of Arizona voters who support a ban. So I think largely what Republicans can do now is try to make this as sort of quiet of an issue as possible. They're going to try to keep it out of the news. We saw that Republicans did join with Democrats to repeal the ban. And I think in large part that was kind of try to stop the damage as much as possible and to get people thinking about other issues.
Speaking about other issues, Republicans are really honing in on issues like immigration, while Democrats are leaning on abortion access. How does that help them in their campaign? Have you seen that influence how voters are coming out to the polls in past elections?
Well,
Mhm.
immigration is always a huge issue in Arizona and across the country for both Democrats and for Republicans. It's a hard issue right now because I don't think either party has proven themselves as being particularly effective on abortion in recent years, and it's difficult for voters to know which party would be best because it frankly does require a lot of bipartisanship in Washington. That's just not happening right now. Now, what I find in the polling that I'm doing among Arizona voters is that, border security is a really huge issue. But when I ask Arizona voters, what are they more concerned about? Are they concerned about undocumented immigrants or are they concerned about drugs and weapons? They're significantly more concerned about the flow of drugs and weapons coming over the border than they are towards immigrants. Immigration itself is not as much of a concern as is illegal things, dangerous things coming over the border.
And when Arizona voters are ranking their top issues, what does that end up looking like?
Yeah, issues are always so difficult to measure because every issue is important. I mean, I took a poll the other day and they were saying, is the housing crisis important? Yes. Are drugs important? Yes. Is education important? Yes. I mean, it's all important. So it's really hard for people to rank these things. Typically, what we'll find is that in political science, we call this issue public. So every issue has a public, a core group of people that really care about that issue. It's the issue that matters most to them. And that varies across the population. Some issues have larger publics than others. And of course, the border is going to be a really important issue for a lot of people. But by having something like abortion on the ballot, I think that's probably going to have a bigger impact when it comes to mobilization. Again, the problem with the border as an issue is no party is really putting forward a coherent solution that people can really sort of grab hold of. And that's what makes it harder when it comes to mobilizing votes.
Samara, could I jump in,
Please
Paola?
do.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you have any experience or have observed where there are competing initiatives on a ballot, because we've heard from some Republicans in the legislature that they are intending to put at least one, if not two, sort of alternate provisions, and particularly, I think what might be most effective from their perspective would be a provision that an initiative, a proposal that would be a modest proposal preserving legislative authority or something along that line. Anyway, what about competing initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what really is going to make a big difference is how active each initiative's sort of grassroots organizers are in getting sympathetic voters out to vote. Now, with every initiative that lines up with one policy position, or one, I should say, one ideological position, it also is appealing to the other group too, because they want to come out and vote it down. It all depends on sort of how people can get their publics out. If pro-choice groups are able to get enough voters out to support their ballot initiative, they'll also be out there to defeat the other. So they sort of end up competing with each other right at the ballot, and it just comes down to issue importance.
For those who don't know what the ballot initiative that we're referring to is, could you walk me through what Arizonans for Reproductive Freedom are trying to bring to the ballot this fall?
Sure. Now, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware, the language of the ballot initiative that I have seen guarantees the right to an abortion until the point of viability, until the fetus is viable. And that is as specific as I've seen. Barbara, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Is that what you're saying as
Well,
well, until viability? There's no
the elective abortion up to the point of viability, but post-viability abortion, if necessary, to save the life of the pregnant person or protect her mental or physical health.
And so
And that's
question for you, Barbara, is when it comes to viability, there's no specific weeks or identified on the ballot initiative. So is that an issue that is then just left to a doctor to determine?
yeah, there actually are several areas that are ambiguous in the ballot, but that basically is it would be a codification of Roe v. Wade. It is the standard that was announced back in 1973 in that court opinion. But yeah, it doesn't define viability by week.
And Samara, have you done polling on that? And if so, how are voters feeling about that ballot initiative?
I haven't done polling on the direct ballot initiative. I've only done polling on support for abortion rights at various stages. And I can tell you that in my polling, half of registered voters, a full 50%, believe that abortion should be legal until, at a minimum, the end of the second trimester. So again, viability, as Barbara just mentioned, is a bit of an ambiguous term. We see 62% of voters who believe that abortion should be legal until at least 15 weeks. So it really depends on which point of abortion you're looking at, but there's really overwhelming support for abortion rights. Generally, again, with half and even 41% saying that it should be left to a woman and her doctor at any point. So this suggests pretty broad support for a ballot initiative of the kind that we were describing.
As Barbara mentioned, there are rumors that other ballot initiatives may come forward. How do voters normally react when they're completing their ballot and they see these questions?
So the most useful cue that people can use when they're looking at ballot initiatives is always endorsements. There's lots of political science studies that try to figure out how people figure out what's on a ballot. And, there's lots of different ways, but frankly, none of us who live normal lives have the time to sit down and study every single candidate and every single issue. And that's why we have helpful heuristics. Like partisanship is a helpful heuristic. You know who's a Democrat, you know who's a Republican. You can do some research, but at the end of the day, that's going to be a really useful cue. With things like ballot initiatives, endorsements are huge. So which organizations, which candidates are endorsing each of these initiatives? And by making that really salient to voters, it makes it really clear how they should be voting. The League of Women Voters, for example, or various organizations in Arizona will often put out a slate of ballot initiatives showing which ones they oppose and which ones they support. And that allows voters to have a more straightforward cue to help them in their voting.
And do they tend to vote on these questions?
Yeah, I mean, if people are filling out their ballot, mostly we do it by mail here in Arizona. People will vote for ballot initiatives when given the information that they need, and I think that's part of the challenge for these organizations who are working to get something on the ballot. Obviously, the biggest hurdle we think about is getting enough signatures. But the second hurdle that people are going to be really working towards is getting the information out, making sure people understand what it is. The wording can often be incredibly complicated, very convoluted. Sometimes there's double negatives in there. You're not exactly sure what they're trying to get across. So getting that information out to voters so they understand what these mean is going to be a huge effort on the part of these groups.
And as a reminder to our audience, feel free to send in questions in our Q&A chat. We will be answering them throughout our conversation tonight. And when it comes to compare, as we talked about before, As Barbara had mentioned, there is conversation about bringing it forward other initiatives. And Barbara or Samara, feel free to answer the question, but what are the other initiatives that we're looking to see on the ballot when it comes to abortion?
If you're asking for specifics, I haven't seen anything specific yet. I know that the legislature, it takes only a majority of the legislature of both houses to put an initiative on the ballot. And the first, apparently the first initiative to get through the Secretary of State's approval process goes on the ballot first. So there is placement on the ballot. Maybe the priority on the ballot affects voters' choices. Samara would know more about that. But I haven't seen the specifics. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the goals was to come up with an initiative that would be identified as a more modest protection and not stripping the legislature of authority to regulate. But I've also heard that there might be a goal of simply confusing voters so that they don't really understand the difference and might vote for an initiative that would be quite restrictive.
A quick clarification from our audience. The Arizona for Abortion Access is doing the initiative, not the Arizonans for Reproductive Freedom. As we move forward, what is the best advice that you may have when it comes to voters coming to their polls or going to their ballots and trying to understand what questions are being asked? That can be quite confusing.
Well, we are so lucky here in Arizona because we have such a robust mail-in voting system. We're not in a situation where you have to show up at the polls in a booth with no information at your fingertips, trying to figure out what to do. When I get my ballot, I keep it for a couple days. I sit at the kitchen table, I have my laptop open, I'll read about it, I'll look up endorsements. I find endorsements really helpful. It doesn't have to be something that's done in like a higher pressure situation. And that's like it's a really nice privilege of having the ballot mailed to your home that you can sit and really learn about it. So I always encourage voters to see who's endorsing each issue, who's endorsing each candidate. Talk to people you trust. I have friends who may know more about a particular issue than I do, and I'll ask them, what do you think about it? It can actually be a really deliberative process with friends, with the news, and that's one of the really nice parts of having mail-in voting as part of our process in Arizona.
Well, we have asked quite a few questions tonight. Is there anything that we haven't talked about when it comes to understanding the future of abortion access in Arizona and what Arizonans should expect for the fall?
Well, all I'll say is, Arizona is an incredibly important state politically. We have an electorate that is so closely divided between Democrats, Republicans, and registered independents, and we have unbelievably narrow margins of victory in this state, not only when we're thinking about our presidential election, but also local races. So I really cannot overstate how important it is to vote in the fall, regardless of what your preferences are, who you're voting for. Some of these races will be won by a couple hundred votes. We have seen that in the past. So I really cannot overemphasize how important it is to vote and to make sure you have a plan for voting in the fall.
I totally agree with that. And I also agree with Samara's statement. It's about paying attention to who's endorsing what on the ballot, what initiatives, who's behind them, and also carefully reading the voluminous information that we get from the Secretary of State on these measures. I think they're going to be an open primary initiative and some other very important things that will be on the ballot, not to mention the races themselves that are going to be so important. And I think in Southern Arizona, we've got, a congressional race, Congressional District 6, which is very important. And this issue is, I think, going to be something that will be at the forefront of a debate between the candidates, Juan Ciscomani and Kirsten Engel, probably. So I would say educate yourselves, voters, and then vote.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd add is, as Barbara said, the ballot is not a closed book exam. You don't cheat by asking people, by looking up information, and you should really use it as an opportunity to ask people. I have friends who have who have experience in areas I don't. I like to look at different newspapers, different endorsements, look at op-eds that have been written, and use all of that information to make the best choices.
Well, thank you so much, Samara and Barbara. And thanks to our audience for joining us tonight for this AZPM Your Vote 2024 Town Hall. Next week, join us for a town hall discussion on the minimum wage. To keep up with our election coverage this year, be sure to visit the Your Vote section of our website, news.azpm.org. I'm Paola Rodriguez. Have a good night.